As the clock ticked down the final minutes before 2,000 hours in Washington, the international system entered a near standstill. Strategic actors watching, waiting, and recalculating in real time. Worst-case contingencies were no longer theoretical. They had been fully operationalized. Air assets were in position. Target packages had been finalized and verified. Command and control channels stood ready. At this stage, the threshold for execution had narrowed to a single authorization. Upon issuance, Iran would likely have faced one of the most consequential nights in its modern strategic history. This was no longer coercive signaling. It was a fully postured strike operation, awaiting execution authority. Yet at the precise moment when escalation appeared irreversible, approximately 90 minutes before the ultimatum window closed, an unexpected variable entered the equation. What caused the pause? Not a deficit in force projection capability, not a breakdown in military pressure. Instead, an unanticipated factor, emerging at the final decision node, introduced enough disruption to alter the trajectory of an operation that, by all observable metrics, had already reached execution readiness. That single decision may have pulled the Middle East back from the brink of large-scale conflict, or merely deferred the confrontation to a later, potentially more volatile phase. The timeline had been firmly set. 2,000 hours, April 7th, Eastern Time. 0700 hours, April 8th, in Vietnam. This was not a routine deadline, but a potential trigger for a full-spectrum air campaign against Iran. As the window narrowed, global attention focused on Washington and Tehran, the primary centers of gravity in a rapidly accelerating strategic standoff. What intensified the situation was not just the ultimatum, but a sharply divergent message from Donald Trump on social media. He issued a near-apocalyptic warning. Tonight, entire civilization could be erased, with no opportunity for recovery. I do not want that outcome, but it may become reality. The language mirrored a transition from contingency framing to imminent worst-case projection. Yet, in the same breath, he introduced an unexpected off-ramp, hinting at a possible de-escalation pathway, even a strategic inflection point with transformative potential. However, if we are entering a comprehensive regime change, one that installs sharper, more decisive actors, a positive, even revolutionary shift is possible. He then closed with a deliberately ambiguous line. Who knows, perhaps tonight we'll have the answer. This was not merely predictive language. It signaled a potential power transition inside Iran, an outcome capable of reshaping the regional order. Donald Trump further elevated the stakes, framing the moment as a historic inflection point before delivering a forceful accusatory conclusion. Decades of coercion, corruption, and violence nearing termination. In operational terms, the message implied that a large-scale campaign was not hypothetical. It was pre-configured and ready for immediate activation. No longer characterized by impulsive or unscripted rhetoric, the tone had shifted to one of historical weight and strategic intent, suggesting an effort to frame a decisive geopolitical turning point. The change in messaging style from Donald Trump signaled a clear transition into a new operational phase. During a White House briefing, the ultimatum was defined in unambiguous terms. If, before 2,000 hours Eastern Time, Iran failed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and reject, or accept, depending on interpretation, the proposed U.S. terms, a 4-hour, full-spectrum air campaign would be immediately initiated. This was not a generalized threat. Trump outlined a high-impact strike scenario. Nationwide bridge infrastructure degraded before midnight. Power generation facilities simultaneously disabled, ignited, or destroyed, effectively collapsing the country's energy grid. The objective extended beyond tactical strikes, targeting systemic national functionality. Concurrently, Israel Defense Forces issued urgent advisories urging Iranian civilians to avoid railway infrastructure, while Saudi Arabia released parallel warnings calling for the immediate suspension of rail network usage nationwide, further reinforcing indicators of imminent large-scale kinetic operations. These coordinated moves pointed to a multi-axis operation, with logistics and transportation networks squarely in the targeting matrix. Notably, Benjamin Netanyahu stated that Israeli forces had destroyed dozens of Iranian transport aircraft and helicopters, a direct hit on strategic mobility. A US-Israel alignment, not only preparing for strikes, but actively degrading Iran's rapid response capacity to secure preemptive dominance. Behind the rhetoric, the Pentagon was reportedly finalizing a decisive target list, prioritizing dual-use energy infrastructure, assets critical to both civilian and military operations. Pete Hegseth further streamlined targeting criteria. Any power facility linked, even marginally, to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps could qualify for engagement. This approach effectively expanded the target set, rendering much of Iran's energy grid a strategic vulnerability. The operational focus centered on two critical target sets: bridges and power plants. An intentional, not arbitrary selection. Destruction of bridge networks would sever Iran's strategic mobility, preventing Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps missile units from maneuvering. Simultaneously, weapons and logistics flows would be disrupted, fragmenting the battle space into isolated zones and driving near-total paralysis of wartime sustainment. Targeting the power grid carried even deeper strategic impact. Iran's electrical network, one of the most complex in the region, underpins national command, control, and communications. Its collapse would halt industrial output while degrading military C2, surveillance systems, and state media channels. Erosion of centralized control, and the emergence of a strategic vacuum exploitable by opposing forces. In this context, rhetoric from Donald Trump about a return to a primitive state shifts from figurative language to a clear deterrent signal, aimed at the systemic dismantling of Iran's critical infrastructure. Beyond immediate battlefield effects, such degradation would likely fracture Iran's command hierarchy, forcing a shift toward decentralized or localized control structures. This, in turn, increases the risk of miscalculation, delayed response cycles, and reduced coordination across operational theaters. Conversely, Chinese state-aligned media offered a divergent assessment. Xinhua news agency, cited by regional outlets, argued that time was not on Trump's side, framing his options as binary: concede to Iran or risk dragging both the US and its allies toward the very systemic collapse scenario he warned against. Tensions further escalated when Mehdi Mohammadi, advisor to Iran's parliamentary leadership, asserted on April 7th that Iran had seized the initiative in the confrontation and would accept no outcome short of consolidating its gains while shaping a new regional security architecture. This statement went beyond signaling. It was a direct challenge to Washington. Mehdi Mohammadi emphasized that Donald Trump had roughly 20 hours to decide: concede to Iran or risk seeing US allies pushed toward the very primitive state he warned of. He simultaneously reinforced Tehran's hardline posture: no concessions under pressure. As the world fixed on the 2,000 hours Eastern deadline, indicators suggested a shift from deterrence to execution. US-Israel forces transitioning from warning to on-the-ground action. Escalation has since moved closer to the threshold of full-scale conflict. The latest developments elevated tensions further, as Iran's primary crude export hub came under large-scale airstrike. This is not just a strategic site, it is the economic lifeline of Iran, handling up to 90% of export output through a confined island corridor. Strikes on this node equate to direct pressure on the core of Iran's national economy. Unlike earlier probing strikes, US forces demonstrated a clear shift in approach, expanding beyond military targets, such as radar sites and ammunition depots, to include oil storage facilities and port infrastructure, the core pillars of Iran's economy. This reflects a deliberate economic strangulation strategy aimed at severing energy exports, Tehran's primary revenue stream. At the same time, Israel escalated the battle space by striking the South Pars gas field, one of the world's largest energy reserves. In operational terms, US actions degrade supply, cutting the blood, while Israeli strikes disrupt production capacity, cutting the legs. While U.S. authorization remained pending, Israel appeared to initiate limited or preparatory strikes, marking an early shift from deterrence toward execution. Despite the pending U.S. authorization, Israel appeared to initiate limited or preparatory strikes, marking an early move beyond coordinated signaling. While Israel framed the strikes as targeting rail systems rather than bridges themselves, the pattern underscores coordinated strategy with the U.S., constraining Iran's mobility and logistics to achieve operational dominance. Targeting the rail network goes beyond infrastructure denial. It directly disrupts the primary force movement corridors of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. With oil exports heavily degraded, rail lines effectively serve as Iran's last internal lifeline for troop mobility and logistics sustainment. Israel's focus on rail systems reflects a calculated strategy: paralyze Iran's rapid response capability across the battle space. In parallel, the U.S. Secretary of Defense confirmed this as the largest and most intense air campaign since hostilities escalated in late March. The U.S.-Israel coalition reportedly deployed over 100 combat aircraft in coordinated strikes against high-value IRGC targets, including missile infrastructure and internal security bases, signaling a transition well beyond limited probing operations. The operational center of gravity remains Tehran, carrying both symbolic and strategic weight. Battlefield imagery indicates U.S. Tomahawk cruise missiles penetrating defenses and striking a military installation east of the capital, delivering not just kinetic impact, but a clear signal. Iran's power center is within direct engagement range. Escalation intensified as multiple large explosions struck an international airport in Tehran overnight, signaling an expansion of the targeting scope to critical aviation hubs, key nodes in strategic connectivity and logistics. At the same time, the U.S.-Israel coalition conducted a high-precision strike in Isfahan, targeting a gathering of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership. Reports indicate significant officer casualties, making it one of the most severe losses in senior personnel since the conflict began. The meeting, reportedly focused on reinforcing operations in the Hormuz region, was neutralized before implementation. While coalition forces increased pressure through precise, deep strike operations, Iran's response sparked international controversy. Following warnings from President Donald Trump about potential strikes on bridges and power plants, Tehran launched a campaign titled "Human Chain for Iran's Youth Future," mobilizing civilians, including public figures and reportedly children, to form human shields around critical infrastructure such as power plants and bridges. Beyond symbolic action, these sites featured signage aimed at international media and extended invitations to thousands of NGO representatives to observe. This indicates that Iran is not only responding militarily, but also expanding into the information domain, turning high-risk locations into focal points of global attention. However, the use of civilians, particularly children, as human shields has triggered intense controversy, raising critical questions about the boundary between strategy and humanitarian norms in an increasingly severe conflict. While Israel and several Middle Eastern states have consistently warned civilians to avoid high-risk areas, Iranian authorities have taken the opposite approach, encouraging public presence, even of minors, near potential targets. This contrast reflects not only strategic divergence, but also a high-risk posture that places civilians at the center of military confrontation. The situation is further complicated by reports from Qom indicating the presence of Pakistani mercenary elements operating under the direction of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. These armed groups have reportedly established checkpoints, conducted vehicle inspections, and even opened fire on civilians, contributing to an atmosphere of internal instability. Taken together, these developments suggest a critical reality. Tehran appears to recognize the limitations of direct military confrontation with the U.S.-Israel coalition, while also demonstrating limited reliance on its conventional forces. In this context, reliance on proxy forces and the use of civilians as strategic tools appears less optional and more of a necessity, despite the controversy it generates. This assessment is reinforced by internal narratives reflecting decades of accumulated trauma under the Islamic Republic. One account describes 47 years marked by systemic repression, torture, violence, humiliation, and fear, largely unseen by the outside world. Such testimony highlights deep internal fractures within Iranian society, now amplified by mounting external pressure. The conflict is no longer defined solely by airstrikes or political messaging. It is increasingly shaped by voices from within, revealing a level of desperation where segments of the population may be willing to accept extreme outcomes in exchange for an end to a prolonged status quo. This assessment is underscored by a deeply distressing account, a point where, for some, any cost is acceptable if it means escaping the current regime. The sentiment suggests that relief, even in the face of bombardment, stems from prolonged exposure to violence, repression, and systemic abuse spanning decades. Such perspectives reveal a harsh paradox. External airstrikes are not viewed solely as destruction, but by some as a potential catalyst for transformative change. This signals that the conflict has moved beyond the military domain, penetrating the deeper layers of social psychology and political belief. Meanwhile, at the international level, shifts are emerging within alliance dynamics, with Kim Jong-un reportedly adjusting his posture despite prior alignment with Tehran. According to South Korean intelligence, North Korea is gradually distancing itself from Tehran, outlining 3 clear principles: no support, no expressions of sympathy, and no criticism of Donald Trump. More notably, Kim Jong-un has reportedly signaled openness to maintaining stable relations with the United States. If accurate, this reflects a meaningful strategic realignment, evidence of states recalibrating their positions as the regional balance shifts. In geopolitical terms, when a regime is perceived as increasingly vulnerable, even long-standing partners may disengage to preserve their own interests. In Iran's case, those indicators are becoming more pronounced as military pressure and diplomatic isolation converge. Yet, at what appeared to be the point of no return, just 90 minutes before the ultimatum deadline, Trump issued an unexpected decision, disrupting the projected escalation trajectory. He stated that the decision followed consultations with Shahbaz Sharif and Asim Munir, alongside a request from Islamabad to delay strikes on Iran that night. The reported condition: Iran must immediately reopen and guarantee security for the Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery for global energy flows. In return, Donald Trump agreed to suspend all bombing and strike operations for 2 weeks. This move goes beyond a tactical pause, signaling the potential emergence of a temporary bilateral ceasefire framework. At peak escalation, the decision represents a strategic pause, creating space for recalibration before any transition into the next phase of confrontation. The decision to pause the air campaign was not framed as a rollback, but by Donald Trump as the culmination of an operational phase that met, and in some areas exceeded, its objectives. From Washington's perspective, the strikes significantly degraded Iran's military capacity while generating sufficient pressure to bring Tehran toward negotiations with a more pragmatic posture. Notably, the U.S. reportedly received a 10-point proposal from Iran, viewed as a viable foundation for a broader settlement, one that could extend beyond bilateral terms and influence the wider Middle East balance. Sources indicate that convergence has been reached on most previously contested issues, suggesting negotiations are more advanced than publicly disclosed. The 2-week pause, therefore, is not merely de-escalatory. It is a critical window to finalize terms and prepare for implementation. It represents a rare transition point from kinetic confrontation to structured negotiation. The rapid shift in dynamics has caught global observers off guard. Regardless of differing interpretations of Trump's announcement, the episode underscores a core reality. In periods of high volatility, stability itself becomes the most valuable and most fragile asset. We'll pause here. Share your perspective and join the discussion.